halfway to the new camp. So we set it down and we thought, oh, we'll come back for it later. Later turned out to be dinner time. And when we went back for it, it was not there. So people searched for about an hour, and we're still not exactly sure whether an animal carried it off or a person carried it off. But all of my carefully prepared dinners were gone. And yet, we set it down. And yet, God fed us in the wilderness. We had enough and more than enough. We even carried out a portion of what we had taken with us. So this is God's provision. Also, Amy's overpacking, but we were fed, and we came up with some interesting food combinations that we might not have otherwise. So today we have a feeding story in the wilderness, Jesus's miracle, the feeding of the 5,000 men plus women and children, maybe 10 or 12 or 15,000 people on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It's a lot of people in one place, hard to imagine these days. And the thing about miracles that I find is that they can be distracting. It tends to become about the miracle. Jesus even complained about this. He said, you're following me not because of the deep teaching that I'm offering you, but because of the miracles, the signs that you're seeing. Miracles, nonetheless, were a significant part of the ministry of Jesus, and they have a place in our scripture, in our gospels, and they deserve our attention, our digestion of them. I came across a book researching the sermon titled "More Than His God Card" about Jesus's miracles. The miracles were more than a simple sign or proof, if you will, of Jesus's divinity. The miracles have a deeper meaning. One of the most helpful descriptions of miracles, in my understanding of them, is miracle as parable. What does this story have to say to us about who God is and who we are in relationship to God? When we ask that question of the feeding on the shores of Galilee, I think there's a lot to say to us, particularly in this moment that we find ourselves in. But I want to rewind from the miracle a little bit and focus first on Jesus. One thing that stood out in this time, reading and listening to the commentary that I was looking at, was Jesus's emotions in this moment. It's always helpful to zoom out a little bit from the particular passage we're looking at. And if we go back a couple chapters in Matthew, we'll discover that Jesus has just been rejected at his hometown in Nazareth. They kicked him out, tried to kill him. And his cousin and mentor, some would say, John the Baptist, has just been beheaded by Herod. This is a difficult moment for Jesus, and he crosses the Sea of Galilee, hoping to find a little solitude, to go to a deserted place, to go to a wilderness place, and spend some time there in this difficult moment, finding God and allowing himself to be found by God. So why is it that Jesus chooses to go to a deserted place, to a wilderness place, in order to find and be found by God? I think it's because Jesus has been found by God in the wilderness before. Just remember, he was driven out into the wilderness, into the desert, by the Holy Spirit to be tempted by Satan immediately after his baptism. And it's in that wilderness place that Jesus learns to depend not on his own strength, but to depend on God. And the starkness of that immediacy of his presence with suffering, with nothing else to distract him or support him, he has only to rely on God. And so Jesus, throughout his ministry, sought out these deserted places, these moments of solitude and prayer, when he could remember it's ultimately just me and God. Like, I'm here and I'm depending on God. Not distracting or avoiding from this difficult moment, but I'm finding some time to be with this difficulty and to be with God at the same time. It also harkens back to the people, God's people, wandering in the desert for 40 years, right? With nothing to rely upon but God, receiving their daily bread every day from God. Besides this moment of grief and of suffering, there's another emotion that the text actually names for Jesus. And it's a word, a Greek word that's translated compassion. But the translation misses this kind of visceral sense. It's a gut-wrenching emotion that compels the person feeling it to action. You can't feel this level of compassion and not be literally moved to do something. And this is what Jesus feels when he crosses the lake to the other side for his moment of solitude and restoration with God, and finds, 10, 15,000 people there waiting for him who had run around the lake to meet him there. Now, I have to say, if I was seeking a moment of solitude and found, thousands of people waiting for me instead, I might be a little grumpy. But Jesus is not grumpy. He feels instead this visceral compassion for them. He's moved by their seeking of him, by their need, because they also went to the wilderness, right, to find what it was that they needed there. And so Jesus moves among them. He cures their sick. He heals them. And then he feeds them. He and the disciples feed them. What is our deep experience of need, of grief, or of suffering in this wilderness world in which we find ourselves? And have we, like Jesus, taken the time to seek out the solitude, to simply be with that, to be with God in that? I believe that it is out of our own experience of God meeting us in our deep need that we will be moved at that deep level with the compassion out of which we cannot help but act and help to meet the deep needs of others. See, but we have to actually stop and experience our need in order to experience God meeting that need. If my food bag hadn't been disappeared in the wilderness, I probably wouldn't have been as grateful for every meal that I was able to scrounge out of the extra snacks that we brought. It's in our need and our being present to our need, our learning to depend on God, that God meets us and feeds us, performing miracles every day. What we need is here. There is enough and more than enough. And God meets us as we meet each other. So let's see if we can kind of break it down into some steps here. So number one, right, experience the need. And that may be my need or someone else's need. I know that a lot of us right now are being deeply moved by the needs that we see in this world. But go to that wilderness, feel that grief and that suffering and that pain, and be present to it. And allow God to be present to you in it. So bring that need then to God, right? That's step two, is to here's the need and here's God. Just offer it up to God. And then pray. What does Jesus do? He blesses the bread, right? He prays, and then he shares. He shares it. He does what he's moved to do out of that experience of God's presence and his compassion. And then I think this is such an interesting part of the story that's so often overlooked. They collect the pieces, right? They gather up the leftovers. Why did they do that? They could have just let people take the leftovers home or left them out on the grass for the birds. But they collect the leftovers into baskets. And from the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, there are 12 baskets full of leftovers. I think this is a lot like reflecting on our past experience to find where it is that God has been present for us. It's like lifting up and naming the miracles, seeing them in retrospect so that we might be more able to see them when they happen again. Looking back and seeing where it is that God has provided, where it is that there has been, in spite of apparent scarcity and suffering, where there has been enough and more than enough. Gathering those miracles together, lifting them up and naming them for ourselves and for one another. So this morning, I thought I would gather some miracles for us and name and lift up some miracles that I've seen in our life together in these last 4 months. I want to name one for you that you've heard of before, but it continues to unfold as a real labor of love. And it's a literal feeding, right? Feeding of actually 5,000 in Napa Valley New Deal, our feeding program is being birthed here at Grace Church to connect the chefs and restaurants in our valley with people in need of food, people struggling economically during this pandemic and the aftermath. They fed almost 5,000 meals, primarily passing them out through the school district to the children that receive the free and reduced lunch and breakfasts. They're also getting dinners each week for their families. Meeting that need, seeing that struggle, seeing the gifts also, what we have in our community, right? So many people with culinary talents and offering them to God and bringing them together. We've had now 4 sessions of our monthly forum with Rebecca Bell called It's Okay Not to Be Okay. And as we've gone through those 4 sessions, we've learned to truly be present to our own grief, to our own anger, to our own disappointment. It's been about 20 people and a pretty stable group of people that have attended these sessions over the last 4 months. And what we've seen is that new life is springing up out of the fertile ground of our willingness to be present with this difficulty in ourselves and in our world. Kairos is another example. The prison retreat ministry at San Quentin that many members of Grace and the St. Helena community have been a part of for a long time had no idea in February when they went into the prison for their Kairos retreat that it would be the last time many people from the outside would be able to enter San Quentin prison. Some prisoners who were infected with COVID-19 were transferred to San Quentin. And now, out of about 3,700 occupants, at least 2,000 of them, more than half of them, have been diagnosed with COVID-19. And to date, 16 of them have died. And members of the Kairos community, including James Alexander, who spoke with us last week, are present, spiritually and emotionally present with this incredibly difficult reality, with the suffering of, as they're called, the men in blue. They're praying for them, they're writing notes to them. And while this might seem like very, very little to offer, right? As little as 5 loaves and 2 fish for 15,000 people, it's actually quite significant for people who feel and know that the world has forgotten them, that their society has counted their lives as expendable, to know there are people on the outside who actually care, who are sending love to them in that place of deep suffering and abandonment and anguish. I had an experience this week of difficulty just facing the school choices that were being given, none of them seeming like good choices, and just coming to this place of real consternation in my spirit. And so I reached out to about a dozen fellow parents and educators in our community. And over the last few days, I've received so much wisdom and perspective. It's like the blessing and the abundance that comes when we begin to make those connections. And now, instead of anguish, I actually have hope. I have hope for my kids. I have hope for other kids that have fewer opportunities and resources than mine, that our community will, as it always has, come around families and children in this difficult time. I have hope that none of us are truly ever alone. So these are some of my baskets full of leftovers. What are yours? What wilderness are you experiencing in this time of pandemic, in this time of increasing awareness and visibility of the sin of white supremacy in our country and on the many other ills that are being brought to the surface in this barometric pressure that's coming to bear on all of us. What is your wilderness? What is your suffering? What pain, either yours or someone else's, is moving you so viscerally, so deeply that you must act? What little do you have? Whether it's a little time, a little talent, a little treasure that might be offered up to God in the service of others. Begin to meet needs so that there can be enough and more than enough. And where has God been present for you in this wilderness? What are your baskets full of leftovers for which you can give thanks? How has God been feeding you? In God's economy, as Gretchen Wolfe Pritchard, the author of the Beulah Land children's Sunday school curriculum, says about this story, God's love is always enough and more than enough. What we need is here.